So thanks for coming out, everybody. This is a hybrid program. So we have Richard in the room, us in the room, and people out in Zoom land. So a few things to keep in mind. For restrooms here, we're just down there in the lobby. We don't seem to have a problem with social distancing in the room tonight. So you feel free to move the chairs however you like. We will be recording this session, and actually, speakers, Richard and I won't have our masks on. So if that's a problem, you can move back further. I'll put mine on as soon as I'm done. And if you have any questions out there in Zoom land, you can use the chat feature. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll run a quick 2-question poll that we do at the end of all of our programs. Tonight is episode 6 of the Endurance series. I'm delighted that this series has been going on. Let me let more people in the room. We've got lots, sounds like. Oh.
Love that sound.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, people are joining like banshees on the Zoom. So tonight's episode 6. Next Wednesday is episode 7 with Bruce. Hi, Bruce. I know he's out there. Bruce Benton. He'll be speaking on the eradication of river blindness in Africa, in which he was. Then we have episode 8 in March on the 24th with Katie Bowman. She's a biomechanist. She'll be here on Sunday. And then we have episode 9. She's on the 27th. Bird migration is on the 24th with Barbara Jensen from San Juan Island. And then finally in April, we're hoping to close it down with Erden Aruch, who is rowing across the Pacific right now. You heard that right, rowing. And I'll put a link in the chat where you can watch the tracker. We have other programs that happen at the library, recurring programs like Tech Tuesday and chess on the first and third Sundays and game night on the third Sundays. We also will be making lanterns like this lovely on February 13th. And if you want to do that, just let me know. A few thank yous, friends of the library. They contribute to the library. Without them, we couldn't make it happen. Thank you for attending in person and in Zoom land. Thank you to all the colleagues who make this library run, and tonight's speaker, Richard Rhodes. I had the very good fortune to meet Richard. It's been about 10 years ago, I think now. We were standing in line at Seattle's town hall, waiting to get books signed by, I think, Dave Eggers and Maria Semple. It was a long line, and we struck up a conversation, and as often happens, found out within minutes it was, 1 or 2 degrees of separation. I had weeks earlier in the Midtown Valley met an author who rented space from Richard when he had his carving studio. Well, I'm still with your thinking studio. And it was always fun to stop by the carving studio and see what was up and get a cup of tea. And if I was really lucky, a slice of bread, because Richard is an exceptional baker. He's a sculptor, a stonemason, an entrepreneur and scholar of stonework worldwide. You can read about him on his website. I'll send that in the chat as well. He has twice addressed the National Convention of the American Institute of Architecture, the Association of Professional Landscape Designers. He was in Siena, Italy he was the last apprentice. I love that. I always think of Disney.
Right.
Sorcerer's Apprentice.
Just like that.
Just like it. And he's delivered a 5-lecture educational series to the Institute of Classical Architecture, both New York and San Francisco, and lectured to the Building Stone Institute and many other public and private universities. I am so thrilled he's here tonight and come to Orcas Island all this way as part of our Endurance series. And so I'm going to hand it over to him and let all those other dings in the room. Thanks again, Richard.
Of course.
Yeah.
Let all those people in, and then I'll begin. It's good that they come.
Mm-hmm.
So welcome, everybody. This is definitely the smallest group I've ever spoken to, which is fantastic. And I so appreciate that you're the intrepid souls that have come out on a cold January night in the third phase of a vicious pandemic that is keeping us all unhappily in a small life, but we're all doing what we can. You know, it's important that you're here in person because, as you'll see from my work, it's all about immediacy on some level. And although I love the technology that has allowed many of you to join me tonight, either through great distance or through health concerns, which are totally valid, it's very, very difficult to make that kind of connection to what you're saying if you don't have real people in the room. So thank you. Thank you for doing that. You know, I think Orcus and this library are extremely lucky to have lured Carol. She's a bright light, and I'm really fortunate to count you as a friend. So thank you for having me out here. Carol posed this question, which is, how did stone become this symbol of endurance in our world? And it's a very interesting question, and in some ways a difficult question. But human beings have, since earliest times, have always turned to stone to mark their important monuments, to commemorate the people that either had passed or who had done great things. We find it even reflected in our language to say something is set in stone or cast in stone or carved in stone. You know, these are the essence of permanence. And I've done, you know, maybe decades of thinking about this as I have worked this pretty intractable material. That intractability is both its blessing and its curse. We would say in the trade that it's the torture of the craft, right? What is, you know, to leave your mark in stone requires a great commitment and in some way a great focusing of the human intention. So once we turn to stone, you know, why is that? Stone is this hard material, and in some ways it's one of the hardest materials we have at our disposal. And it's that very permanence, that what I call stone's legacy promise, that causes us to turn to it, but also is a kind of it demands something important from us. It demands that I mean, the slow working of stone requires that we make our intentions super clear and that we approach it with great skill and in some ways great reverence. And that's certainly been its attraction for me. You know, how hard is stone? Well, a stone sculpture in granite, like the material I work in primarily, weathers 1 inch in 10,000 years. So let's think about that. That means that a stone carving that I put out on Orcas Island, for example, 1,000 years from now, it will have weathered 1/8 of an inch. And to me, that's really important. That means that you know, much of the work that we do as artists, which is to kind of have these feelers out in the world and try to synthesize something about our time and our period. But essentially what we synthesize, what we come up with, will carry forward and will be legible for future generations. That's why we turn to stone. I'm also reminded of a story that I'll share with you of my apprenticeship, and we're going to see some of my apprenticeship later in this talk. But in my apprenticeship, I had one of my first jobs was to work on a section of the Roman wall that runs around the city of Siena. Now you have to put this in context with a young man who grew up in the suburbs of California. I'm standing there wearing tennis shoes, taking out bricks that had been cast and and set in this wall some 2,000 years prior. And as I'm taking out these bricks and cleaning them and preparing for them to be reset by the mason team that I'm with, I'm thinking, you know, this wall has obviously outlived the people who made it, but it also outlived their family name. It outlived their civilization. And now that I think about it, I realize it outlived 2 more civilizations. You know, so in the great timeline of the cosmos, suddenly you get this incredible view of yourself standing in tennis shoes in front of a wall, and it's all, you know, it's all legible somehow. It's all deeply legible. The other story that I'd like to invoke is, I hope will make you smile, and that is, you know, we are in a library, and I think all of us, one of our first encounters with stone is the story of the 3 little pigs. And remember, it's the 3rd pig who built his house of stone that is able to shelter his brothers and survive the terror of the big bad wolf. So human beings have always turned to stone for reasons high and low. And I think that speaks to its enduring quality. So I think the best way to kind of share that, but with that in mind, is to take you into my world of stone and sculpture and sort of show you how I think about it. So, got a little agenda here. I'm going to talk about how we make stone expressive. What is stone expression? I'm going to talk a little bit about the grammar of stone, which is a fancy architectural term for the, you know, the palette, really. If you think of, you know, being a painter, it's pretty obvious that he's, you know, he or she has red, yellow, white, you know, I mean, you know what the palette is, right? But what's the palette of stone? What's the grammar of it? What's the vocabulary that we use to build these things? And then I'll talk a little bit about the discipline of it. We'll sort of switch to my world, and I'll talk a little bit about my apprenticeship in Italy. And then a kind of an overview of some of my sculptural pieces, and then I'll take your questions. And speaking of questions, you know, my preference is that we treat this as a place of community, that we are here to share knowledge. I'm going to share what I know. And when I'm not clear and you have a question, I hope you'll just shoot up your hand and we can address it. It's not a lecture. I'm not a, you know, I'm just like you, except I'm doing this other thing. And I'm just going to talk about that. But if you have a question, I can almost guarantee that someone else in the audience has a question too. And I apologize to those that are on Zoom who it's a little harder. You can hit that little icon and maybe if Carol feels that, yeah, you can interject it and maybe we can work that way.
Yeah.
So feel free to do it. With that, we're off to the races. So what is stone expression, right? So this is an interesting building, 2,800 years old. We know it's that age because we can date the poetry that's carved just underneath it. There was a meditation cave. It's in northern China, and there's something deeply expressive about it. So what is that? And I'm not necessarily going to answer these questions, but I want to pose them for your consideration. Because I think in some ways it takes a lifetime to sort of tease this out. This is a magnificent sculpture called a Kuros. It was found in Greece in 1986. It was recently dug up. It's one of the largest modern discoveries. And these were celebrated, obviously, on the island of Crete. And it's, again, deeply, deeply expressive. but these are just sort of touch points around different ways that stone has expressed itself. This is a carving from the 16th century, one of my very favorites and near and dear to my heart because it shows 4 different masons. They're called the Cuatro Coronati, and they are the patron saints of stonemasonry because they were put to death under Nero for refusing to carve false idols. So there you have it. But what's interesting also is the content of this sculpture, where you see on the left, you see what are called banker carvers. Banker carvers carve things on the banker, which is that structure that puts the stone at the appropriate height, and they're carving moldings. And most of my apprenticeship was spent as a banker carver doing that exact work. At some point, when the carver reaches sufficient skill, the natural progression was to head to what we would today call sculpture. At this period, there was no differentiation, but you would move into figurative work. And so on the right side, you see the 2 masons carving floral capitals and carving a figure. Very expressive work. So now we're into sort of what is the palette, what is the grammar of stone? And one of the primary things we come to stone for is its inexplicable mass. One of the first things you know about a stone is how big it is, how heavy it is, how it holds space. And it's part of that ability that it holds space that really allows, it kind of speaks to us and says in many ways, hey, we want that to speak forward. We want to leverage that. So in this particular example, the mass is created with very, very small objects. So these are tiny stones making very big things. And in fact, this is what's called the Thessalian walls that ran around Constantinople, built in about the 5th century AD, I'm sorry. They stood for 1,000 years. It was a double ring wall. They stood for 1,000 years until the invention of gunpowder, and the Turks finally blew the walls apart and were successfully sieged the city. It stood for 1,000 years without falling, and all made of small units. So this is another way we approach mass, which is to carve very, very large things out of single stones, right? So again, there's a person in the background. You can make it out here, and the size of these toes, this goes up 65 feet. It's in India. It's one of the largest human figures in the world, and it's a single stone. It's absolutely stunning. The Incas knew a lot about mass and used mass very, very successfully. We speculate that they used mass to intimidate their rivals. Essentially, they would invite a kingdom, the next tribe or another kingdom, they would invite them and host them for games in front of these walls, is what the latest thinking is. These walls are constructed of 300 to 350 ton single stones that were dragged almost 20 miles across a valley, up a hill to the town of Cusco. And then, of course, they were fit together as if they had some sort of lightsaber that could do this, and it's actually all done with hammer stones. So a tremendously intimidating piece of work. 500 years later, I still find it intimidating, and I've studied it my whole life. So the theory is they would invite these other kingdoms to a series of games, and at the end of the week, they would say, so, what do you think of the walls? So, yeah, pretty good, right? So you want to fight us or you want to join us? And they reportedly never had to fight, because who's going to say a kingdom that can do this, that we're going to win, right? Fascinating story, and an interesting use of mass. This is in Great Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, and in this case, you see the natural mass of the living rock erupting from the soil, and then small units composing very, very thick walls, creating a citadel at the top. And a truly interesting and arresting use of mass. Another Roman use of mass where you actually carved into the living rock. This is Petra. And there is a magnificent room. Of course, you know, it's in Jordan where it's very, very hot. But you're down in these fjords, really, we would call them, and these deep ravines. And then you go into the living rock, which is perfectly cool, right? So there's magnificent edifice carved into the living rock, into the entire mass, the living mass of the planet. One of the most extraordinary things I've seen. So the second key lever we have as artists in stone, the second color on our palette, really, is pattern. There are fantastic patterns and unusual patterns that can be done. This is an Incan pattern, 16th century, done by what most of us would call a Stone Age culture. They had not invented the wheel. They didn't have a written language. They had a tiny, tiny amount of bronze, but they didn't use it for carving. They used meteorite and hammerstones, and they produced these incredible patterns. Patterns that I would argue are at the level of the best stone sculpture in the world. I look at this wall and I would think, oh, Noguchi did that, clearly. And it was an illiterate Stone Age culture by our definition, an illiterate Stone Age culture in the 16th century. This is Egyptian work. It's very, very subtle, but those joints that are inclined and follow the batter of the wall really give the staid quality of this, the formal quality of this, something very, very special. 13th century Indian work in Rajasthan, very tightly wrought, all the pieces fitted together. It's a style of irregular ashlar with very, very fine joints, creating beautiful pattern. One of my favorite walls, more than 1,000 years old, on the south coast of China. These are river stones that are split apart and laid vertically, creating a very, very unusual pattern that obviously stood the test of time. These are pavements in front of the Taj Mahal. Very unusual because as a carver, you can't actually carve a point like that. It'll break off. You know, carving is a percussive action, and as you get to the fine point, there's no way to shape it. And this civilization figured out that they could grind the stones. So essentially they had foot pedals almost like a potter with a stone, and they would wear the stone down at the points, maybe carve the inside, and then wear it down into these beautiful shapes, creating truly magnificent patterns that the world had never seen. Imagine coming from anywhere in the world 1,000 years ago into this court and seeing a pattern like that carved in stone. It would be magic. The next thing that we think about is one of our levers is texture. And stone is capable of fantastic textures. You know, both you have the assembled texture, right? So, you know, what are the size of the pieces? How do I mix them up? How do I put it together? But you also have texture of the tooling itself. So this is Roman handwork, right? You're seeing the chisel stroke. You're seeing how it's been carved. The Romans had iron tools, and that texturing left the surface stippled in that beautiful way. And of course, there are many, many expressive ways that you can texture stone with hard tools. I'm glad this TV has such good resolution because you can see how this is called a boasted pattern. It's done with a sharp blade, and you can see how the stonemason worked across in bands. And in this beautiful raking light, it gives almost like a corduroy texture to the surface, right? This is 125, 130 years old, and looks like it was done yesterday. Cape Town, South Africa. Of course, the Italians are masters at texture, and but this is one of my favorite examples where they've combined smooth materials and textured materials in the same surface. Now, this is in southern Italy in Lecce, and they're really taking advantage of that bright, sharp Mediterranean light, right? So the light is very, very harsh. And so by creating raised surfaces and contrasting them with smooth surfaces, they're punching this magnificent texture, and we get to read it, right? Like that's a very strong example. This is from southern Poland in what's called Lower Silesia, and you see two things. Well, there's lots of things to talk about here, but you see the hand texture on the surface of the stone, and then because the snow banks against this wall every year, as it recedes, it pulls a little of the mortar out. So now you really see the shape of each stone. Right, so you've got the texture of the surface and the texture of the shape working in a really magnificent way here. And this is post-Inca, I believe. So after the conquest by the Spanish in Cusco, but also expressive work. And you can see the influence of the Inca work at a much smaller scale, but a very expressive little wall. And finally, we come to color. And, you know, color, as moderns, we are so spoiled with color. You know, we fan out the Pantel chart and we say, I want 607. Well, that's obviously not the way nature serves it up. And one of the most difficult conversations I invariably have with every client I have ever worked with is, can't you get the stone a little more beige or a little less pink or a little less this or a little more that? And the answer is no. You know, the stone, the beauty of stone, what draws us to stone is its natural variation. And that variation changes over time, which is something that I'm very interested in, especially in the construct of the enduring quality of stone, right? So this wall, 600 years old, and what you're seeing is the iron. The iron ultimately migrates out of all stone. And when it does that, it will manifest in a variety of colors, of which you have no control. Right? So this is a great example of it, where this is all the same stone, but there are different concentrations of iron that have been carried by the groundwater through you're seeing the grain of the stone, right? You're seeing the primary rift. And in those different concentrations over time has created this very beautiful banding, right? It's easy to think, well, oh, that must be different eruptions or different this or different that, but not true. This is granite, and we don't think of granite as containing iron, but even granite contains iron. This is probably 900 to 1,000 years old, and this beautiful, what I call ferrous staining, has changed the texture. So now, you know, you're reading texture, you're reading pattern, and you're reading color, and it's pretty unbelievable. The other thing that happens, and this is the kind of an unusual thing, there's a concept in architecture called palimpsest. Palimpsest is a word from when we used to write on vellum, on leather sheets. The manuscript was so valuable, the goods, the leather was so valuable that after it was done, they would scrape it off and they would write the next thing over. And then when that book was read, or that edict was passed, they'd scrape it off and write it again. And over time, the palimpsest was the legible quality that you could read from the past, because you couldn't always scrape it all the way off. It's like erasing an entire sheet of paper and then reusing it because the paper is so valuable. Well, the same thing happens in architecture. And in this building, so this is in Jordan, but it's right at the intersection of Syria, Israel, and Jordan. This is Roman, but this is arguably the most hostile neighborhood in the entire world. And they routinely knock everything down and then rebuild it. Century after century, millennia after millennia, this has been going on. So you have a Roman structure that's then knocked down. And then they take the pieces and they build it up again, and then they knock it down. And they take it up and knock it down. So what you're actually seeing in this building is multiple buildings. They didn't build it with different colored stones. They built it with, that stone was volcanic, this building was limestone. And in the rubble, in the knocking down, the rebuilding, in the palimpsest, we see the color of these stones coming together to create a new building. Now, originally, this would have been rendered, which is the technical term for a structural plaster. So we might say in English, you stucco it, but the true term is render. So it would have had a render on it, and you wouldn't have seen all these different colors. I love the colors. I think it's a kind of a magnificent, happenstance way to be. And finally, we come to composition. So we can make shapes, right? We can carve shapes in stone. We can assemble shapes in stone. And how we do that and why we do it is at the great center of the mystery of sculpture, right? So when you first come to sculpture, you think, oh, it's all about composition. Yes and no, right? It is part of it, certainly. But all these other things are the tools in which you make that composition expressive. So this is a modern building, right? Very similar in some ways to that Roman building that we saw of different colors. This is done by an architect named Wen Shu. And a little moment of bragging here. I was invited by Wen Shu to lecture at the university that he runs in Hangzhou, China. And it was a great honor. And I got to tour this building, which is in Hangzhou. And his idea was to take the buildings down where this new museum was going to be built, and then use those materials, those bricks and roof tile, in the creation of the new building, and use them as the Romans, or use them as they are used in the Middle East, where a thing is knocked down and you use those materials again, and let it be random and then not covered. So this wall is how the materials from the site were taken off the site and then reintroduced to build the museum walls, and they came in the order they came, and this magnificent composition reflects that, which I think it's one of the best buildings I've seen in the world, in terms of a modern stone building. Compositionally, again, this magnificent shape, and this is architecture. This is ancient architecture. These are the trullo, or the trulli is the plural, of southern Italy, of the Puglia, and this form, this beautiful soft form, created by the stacking of essentially rectangular objects, right? This is subtle, but I think it's a really great example. We call this a Florentine arch, where the inside radius is different than the outside radius, right? And it's a very subtle way of changing the composition. I love this. I'm not sure I can explain it, but this is a vertical wall, and it's just kind of bits and pieces of what they had, but what a fantastic composition. I wish I'd thought of it. So we also can create compositions, again, by massing small things and then carving them, or taking large things and carving them, or, you know, there's so many different ways to do it. It turns out to be kind of a deep question once you start noticing these things. I love this. It's a very simple composition, and it's resonating with this magnificent natural rockscape in the background, right? So it's the same, in a way, it's sort of the same expression as the natural expression, just sort of civilizing it in a funny way that I think is very powerful. So you take all those things together, and eventually you're moving to sculpture. And whether you're moving to sculpture architectonically is how I think of it, like using the traditional methods and forms of architecture, or whether you're doing sculpture, like, you know, in grade school we think of sculpture as cupids and figures and busts and, you know, figurative sculpture. But there's also architectural sculpture, architectonic sculpture. And one thing you'll notice in my practice is that I really spanned both worlds. And my work early on was definitely architectonic. And I think that reflects my training as a banker carver, carving moldings, thinking orthogonally. And as I have matured and my skills have matured, my work, you'll see, has become more figurative, but I'm very comfortable in both worlds. And I draw on both worlds, and I kind of refuse to be limited by these labels that people in the sculpture community worry about. This is at Angkor Wat. There's a powerful thing that happens when you repeat anything, right? As human beings, we love repetition. And when you have repetition and you make very subtle changes with each one, it gets really, really interesting. So these look as if they might be all the same, but actually each face is different, each posture is different, and then you start looking for these very subtle, nuanced differences, which can be very exciting. I love this, and in some ways I miss this, you know? I feel like I was born in the 21st century, the 20th century, when, you know, we had comic books and we didn't get to have this on buildings. You know, imagine when the populace was illiterate and the way we told stories was by carving it in stone, you know? I think it's an incredibly powerful thing to have this level of artistic endeavor on your building. Yes.
Have you seen, I think it's the federal building there, or the courthouse maybe in Port Townsend? The brick building, I can't remember the name of it exactly, but it has a couple.
It has good carvings on it?
Pretty darn cool, yeah.
Excellent. I have not, but I will, I'll pay attention for sure. So this is a little bit lighthearted. Back when I was a wee lad and beginning my apprenticeship, I finished my grad school in England and then headed down to Siena, Italy. This is the Roman town of Siena, and today it looks like this. And many of us will know it from the famous horse race that they run called the Palio, where they're still to this day, twice or three times a year, depending on the year, they'll run the medieval horses around this plaza called the Piazza del Campo. I was very honored, you can imagine, as a young apprentice, to be asked to clean the bricks from two of those sections in the piazza and, you know, supply them to the masons to be reset. I was deeply honored. And it, you know, I still think of it as one of the great accomplishments of my career, ironically, because it's just such a piece of the world's history. And I feel so lucky to have experienced it. So I headed down there because it's the oldest branch of the Freemasons. You may have heard of the Freemasons in the United States, Freemasonry, but this is the operative branch of Freemasonry, which is the original branch, right? The original branch were free men who were the Mason architects. And I had studied them. They were the first labor guild in Europe, the first organized. They had laws. They could travel. They were really super interesting, building magnificent things with a kind of inherited empirical knowledge. So not the kind of rational knowledge that we necessarily, you know, put all our trust in to fight the COVID virus, for example, but rather this kind of inherited rule set that started in ancient Egypt, went to Greece, came to Rome, and then spread through the rest of Europe in the West. And this operative branch was the keeper of that, what's called sacred knowledge. Now, sacred knowledge needs an explanation because from today, where we stand, if you say sacred, people think it's religious. But this was sacred knowledge because these were the state secrets of the time. Imagine if my kingdom can build an arch over a 60-foot chasm, and your kingdom can only build over a 40-foot chasm, then you've got to run your army another 10 miles to get across where we can just take this shortcut. So you can see pretty clearly how this knowledge, which was not well understood, which was passed, you know, through ritual and through apprenticeship and through very serious, you know, people were killed for telling the secrets. So this was a big deal, and it's super interesting. And I've just finished a book that talks about my apprenticeship, and anyway, it goes much deeper into this whole subject. But hopefully it'll be out next year or the following year. See how the world comes together after this pandemic. So let me go back on slide. So the interesting thing is, of course, as a student and as an apprentice, you know, I mean, I was 150% romance. I thought, oh, there's the Mason standing right next to the king. How bad can it be? I didn't notice these guys down below that were actually doing the work. So you show up, I show up, anyone shows up to be an apprentice, and it's brutal. I mean, this is the hardest I've ever worked. And the reality of the work, you know, I look at these paintings and these drawings, these illuminated manuscripts today, and I don't see the king anymore. All I see is that all that material has to go up that scaffold, and then it has to go into the wall, and there's more material, and then there's more after that. And it's bone-breaking work, right? It's great work. You feel, you know, I like to say in the Northwest, 6 months a year, there's no better job on the planet. The other 6 months, not so much. But, you know, it's real work. And when I think I wrapped my head around it was when I really, you know, started to make important steps forward. So the first part of my career or my training as an apprentice was really taking drawings like this and then carving them in stone. And this is, you know, an example. Now we're going to kind of fast forward. I come back to the United States. I begin my practice. Word spreads pretty fast that there's somebody trained in Italy who, you know, so I was very pleased that I picked up a lot of really interesting work pretty quickly. My problem was I didn't know anything about business, and I didn't really care about business. I just wanted to do beautiful work. So I had to figure that out. This is my first quarry, which was up in the British Okanagan. It's a granite quarry, and brought a lot of material out of that quarry over the years. This was my first carving studio down in Seattle on the Duwamish. I had 5 guys, and we carved a lot of architectural moldings, just like the stuff I was doing in Italy, except I was sending it up and down the West Coast mostly. This is a good example, one of my early drawings for a concept for a fireplace. Then the presentation drawing for the client, the carving drawing for my team. You know, how deep do you carve each thing? What's it look like? And of course the finished object. So I also got excited about the work in the national parks. It was really the only place that I saw real masonry in the Northwest. And so I landed a job up on Mount Rainier, where I worked for several seasons. And they have a very interesting thing where they capture all the stone that falls down into the road during the winter, and they stockpile it, and then they want you to build walls with it in the summer. Summer season is very short. It's actually less than 3 months. So we would blaze up there, build a camp, build the walls, and blaze out of there. And it was hard and challenging work. But I was very, very pleased with the result, and I felt like I was able to contribute something to the country that will really speak beyond me. And it had a moving effect on me. This is you may recognize this. This is the pullout at Cayuse Pass, which, if you're taking the long road to Yakima, is right at that shoulder that heads to Yakima. There's a pedestrian bridge there, and I built this pullout. I built all the walls leading up to it and all the walls leading down, but this little section, if you pull over there, there's some very substantial stonework. And this is where it came into focus for me that it really mattered that I was building in granite, that it was, I was modeling the work after the work that had been done in the 30s, and that work is still perfect. And this work, will go the distance. And it really started to come together with me in terms of the enduring quality of stone and what that meant to contribute something at the national park. This was also my first national press. I was interviewed, and it was on NPR, and the head of the national parks at that time said it was the first time, in his opinion, that the work from the WPA period in the 1930s had been successfully matched, which was really a meaningful compliment at the time. I took those skills, obviously, into Seattle and built a lot of stuff around Seattle and up and down the West Coast. This particular home is in Medina, but there's a guy on the roof to give you the scale of that granite. And this is 1/4-inch joint, a very tight, irregular ashlar, modeled, incidentally, on that beautiful expressive wall that I showed you from Rajasthan, from the 12th century. And in this process, I worked out a method of actually building things in a factory setting, like building them on the ground in a workshop, and then numbering the pieces, shipping them to the site. So you weren't doing site fabrication, you're doing site installation, kind of turned the whole equation upside down. And that's a concept that I continue to use today, and it serves me really well. So these are some early pictures. I landed a very interesting job for a certain software billionaire who shall go unnamed in the Bay Area, who needed to have a 15th century Japanese summer palace. And I was lucky enough to land the commission. So this is at my workshop, and we assembled the walls in advance, numbered the pieces, and shipped them to the site to create some pretty unusual walls. We did 17-foot moat walls that curve. They're based on a 15th century castle in Kyoto. And I did 2 granite bridges. This is one of them that was surrounded by the 5-acre man-made lake. There you see it with the water in it. This is a 25 ton boulder hollowed out as a jacuzzi with hot water, and then you jump out of that and swim in the lake. And my second bridge is there in the distance. These are simple projects, but again, consider the expressive quality of it, right? Like that's the path to sculpture. This is a very unusual project that occupied me for 8 years. It's in Greenwich, California. Greenwich, Connecticut, I'm sorry. Again, you'll see some things from some of the slides that I showed you. This is a Florentine arch, right? Intrados, a different radii than the extrados, right? So, looking at history, learning from history, tuning the form, trying to find, a curved stone molding with a hand-carved drip curve, a mason's miter at the corner, carved out of a single block. All these kind of subtle things that hopefully, give something to the overall appearance. This is a patio I did with the late Rich Haig, and he founded the landscape architecture at University of Washington, and a phenomenal, as close to a living treasure landscape architect as we have in this country. I did this, what I call a Roman pool. It's lined with 600-year-old antique granite. This is down in Napa. And to kind of end this work, one of my favorite projects and really a capstone of this part of my career when I was really focused on the architecture, stone architecture. This is a 19th century facade, but carved all by hand in the modern method for a Ralph Lauren store in Greenwich on the little downtown street there in the village. At some point, and the chronology is a little bit, because many of these projects went for many years and they overlap a little bit, but there was a very significant personal tragedy in my life, and I really was forced to turn inward and really kind of reimagine how I was going to continue in this work, and what part of it was meaningful, what part of it still mattered to me, because there's nothing like losing a great loss to really, it's an opportunity at some level to reappraise what matters, and where is your energy going, and is that where it should be going. So I had done sculpture during this whole period. I had always done private commissions, but I was definitely spending a lot of time on business, and I was spending a lot of time on maybe too many projects and not being as personally involved as I wanted. So I decided at that point that I would really go back to this key part, which is what is the expressive part of it. So it's interesting because when you really admit to yourself that you're an artist and you're not just somebody who's kind of a Renaissance man, I'm doing business, I'm doing commissions, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. No, I'm going to come back into this work, but I'm really an artist, and I'm not going to do the rest of it. I'm going to focus on this part that matters to me. It's very confusing for your friends and your family, and people meet you. And what's interesting is that when you're an artist, people look at you in an entirely different way. And I love this from Holland Cotter of the New York Times: artists as feisty cultural delinquents and idiot savants who set themselves up outside the mainstream to make baffling things and think deep thoughts. So what that really means to me is that people when you introduce yourself, oh, I own this company and I'm doing this work, they kind of know, they think they know who you are, and there's a very clear box. When you introduce yourself as an artist, one eyebrow goes up, you can tell they don't know what to make of you, and then you could say anything. It's so interesting, but it's a real thing, and in a way you have to kind of get over that and own it, you know, take the space, like own it. Yeah, okay, so I don't have long hair and I don't run around naked, but I'm an artist and I'm making a living. Deal with it. You know, it's a funny thing. So I'm going to now focus on some of the work that you would recognize as artist work rather than other work, which, I don't know, you know, you blow the box up, right? So this is probably my most well-known sculpture in the Northwest in terms of public work, and it's in the Tacoma Art Museum. I invite all of you to see it. It remains a kind of a favorite of mine. It's a warped hyperbolic paraboloid, which means that my vision for it was I surrounded it with these mirrored glass, and then it's essentially as if you shook the museum and the pavement became a wave, right? So it's an untitled work, but it's a waveform. And technically, it's one of the most advanced things I've done, because how do you get stone to warp, right? So first of all, I used 600-year-old stone pavers from a road that was being demolished in China that I was lucky enough to acquire. And then I built it in a rice paddy and fitted all these stones together. And the way you get the illusion of warpage is each stone looks like a square, but it's actually slightly a diamond. And that creates the illusion of warping. So it's the same way you build a sail, right? You can, you know, sails are flexible, but if you needed to sew a sail, you could take a series of almost squares and you could make that thing shape. Right? So that's what I've done. Or here's a better example. If you had a piece of screen and you twisted it, right, off a square, it would create that warp shape. So it's a very, very complex piece. There you see it in the rice paddy, one of my favorite pictures of all times. We had people cycling 40 miles to see this because imagine seeing this in China. They could not imagine. It was like something came from outer space. They couldn't even conceptualize it. It was so interesting. I was very honored that Dale Chihuly, who I've done a lot of work with over the years, asked if he could do a sculpture on top of my sculpture, which was a great honor. And he did a piece to his mother called Najima Floats, these beautiful balls. What I did not anticipate was that at the end of the exhibition, he donated it to the museum. And the museum said, oh, great, so we're just going to leave those balls there forever. And I was like, I didn't build a pedestal for Dale Chihuly. So we worked an agreement. It might be a stroke of genius on my part, because the agreement is that every year they can relaunch it. And so they put it out there for 2 or 3 months a year. I forget what the contract says. And every year it says, Dale Chihuly and Richard Rhodes, which is just like the best thing. So he's obviously way more famous than I am. And they relaunch it every year, you know, and the rest of the year, it's just my piece. So depending on when you go, you'll see one of 2 things. I've invited other artists to do it. One woman wrapped every square stone in a sweater from the Goodwill and made it the most magnificent quilt. It was so inventive. I was so impressed. Then another guy put a sailboat on it, which was kind of a little bit literal, but you know. Anyway.
Do you move the balls every time, or they always?
No, they all go in there. It's all set. Yeah, set piece. Yeah. Anyway. So I've done a bunch of public work. This was with Ellen Solid, an artist, Seattle artist. These are gates to the city of Ephrata. And actually, this is my interpretation of the Grand Coulee, but I think it's pretty expressive work. I did this with Lorna Jordan, a Seattle artist. This is at the Renton Water Reclamation Plant. But people get married here. They love it. It's called the Grotto. I did this with Brad Goldberg, who's one of the great living stone sculptors in America. He's out of Dallas, Texas. These are 25-ton granite eggs that are hand carved at my studio in China. And there you see them installed at a hospital in Madison, Wisconsin, I think. Milwaukee, Madison or Milwaukee, I forget. And then a quick tour of some private work. I started a commission, I started a series that I call Sentinels. The idea being that they stand witness in the landscape. So I envisioned them as larger than human scale, and hopefully, using that mass and the composition to kind of have a presence and hold space in the landscape. So, I talked a little bit about this at the beginning. Stone is so difficult and it's so time consuming that every move must be choreographed. So, this romantic notion of the sculptor approaching the block and just starting carving, not even on TV would they, no, but they probably would, but that's not how it happens, right? So it's a very deliberate process, many drawings, many models. And so when it really starts to come together, this is a clay model. The clay model gets cast in plaster. The plaster model goes out to the carving studio, and then all your measurements are taken very, in a very calculated way to carve the big one. This is actually two unique pieces that come together to make one form. There you have for scale that's being installed finally, a close-up of this beautiful hand texture. Remember we talked about the legibility of the texture and how you can do different things. Very technical, and of course the final installation. It's a fountain, so there's water that comes up inside of it and very lightly dribbles down the surface, so I'm getting a little wet and dry, and then it hits those black rocks at the base and then recirculates. This is a very interesting piece. The scale of it is hard to grasp. This is my studio in China where I do the majority of my work. I have a studio in Seattle, but it's what I call my thinking studio. So I do the clay and the plaster and the drawing and the research there. But my big work I do in China. And from China, I can ship pieces all over the world, and it's worked very well for me. Unfortunately, it's worked very well until COVID. And I have not been to my studio in 2 years. It's boarded up. I've had 3 guys that have worked for me for almost 20 years, and 2 of them are MIA at this point, and I don't know that I'll get them back. And I don't know when I can go back. You can't go to China unless you're willing to quarantine for 45 days. That doesn't seem like much fun. So it's a different world out there. We're making do. So these, what look like stone discs are actually 9-inch thick sheets of granite that I've carved into specific shapes that I've drawn on paper, right? And I'm using the quarry skin, so the mineral face of the granite, the stained face, which no one had ever done before. That's the part that usually is discarded. So I compositionally took that color, the natural staining that we talked about, and you saw how stone, reacts with iron, even in granite. And then I cut those faces off, carved these shapes, numbered them, and now we're pre-assembling it for fit and finish. And then ultimately it was disassembled and shipped to the site. The site, there it is in the studio. So this is one of 4 abstract forms. So the roof of this building comes in here. The front door is here, which is a glass wall, and then you enter into this space. Anyway, these 4 abstract forms divide the rooms and allow you to separate the living room from the dining room, right? This is a giant fireplace that's open on 3 sides, and this is just temporary on it. So you can see this is a second of the forms. You can see the scale, the approximate scale of it, right? Giant pieces of stone, all fitted and put together.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What kind of tools do you use? Hand chisels and power tools?
Yeah, so I'm a hand carver, and so my tools are primarily hand tools. Now, that being said, I do use some very large diamond saws, with 2-meter blades for example, for this project, to cut that face off the stone, but then all the work in shaping the stone is done with hand tools. This is a part of the Sentinel series that I call Embrace. And you see, I'll take you through the process. So you see an early drawing, you see an early model of one of the pieces in clay, and then you see the piece going together. This is on exhibition in Australia, that's Bondi Beach in the background. And then after this exhibition, it went on another exhibition across the country. So it went across Australia by train to the Indian Ocean and was set up again in Perth for a different exhibition. And the sun, in this case, is setting into the Indian Ocean, and you see it catching that space between the stones. So I had tremendous good fortune. This was reviewed by one of the top sculpture critics in the world out of London, a gentleman named Tom Flynn. And Tom cited this work as best in show. And I had a patron in Vail, Colorado, buy it sight unseen based on that review. So it shipped. It was made in China, went to Sydney, went to Perth, and then shipped all the way back to Vail, Colorado, where in the middle of winter, we installed it to be done by Christmas, as you do. And there it is. Another Sentinel, this is a variation of, the torso is a classic study in sculpture throughout the millennia. Typically, it's on a pedestal. My innovation was to put it on a skirt. So the skirt is actually a fountain. So water is pumped up and comes out between the torso and the skirt. And as you approach the sculpture, that flowing water over the skirt makes it look like the skirt's in motion. It's really, talking about sculpture is the only thing worse. You have to experience these things. Photos are helping a little bit, but it's not quite. So this was out at Molbach's in North Seattle for several years, and then they built a greenhouse there, and they asked me to come and take it down, and it's for sale again if anybody wants to buy it. I was invited in 2016. The most famous artist foundry in Europe called Fonderia Artistica d'Italia invited me, the first American sculptor to be invited, to cast some of my work in bronze. And so I chose 2 of the maquettes from those 2 early Sentinels. And these are the wax, it's a wax process. So you take I took my original maquette, make a mold, you line it with wax. This is and that's how the bronze gets burned out, and you end up with the beautiful bronze, and then the different patinas on the bronze. So ultimately, I did a limited edition of 8, and I'm very pleased to say that they all sold and paid for my third daughter's college tuition at NYU. Go team! This is one of the first Sentinel 1. And actually, 5 of these have sold. There are 3 left, and the The last 3 were just cast and arrived Saturday in Seattle at my studio. So if anybody wants to come to Seattle and preview the last 3 Sentinels in existence that are not in private collections, let me know. More Sentinels to stand in the landscape. This one is installed on Guaymas Island, and I did 2 of them, and it's a charming story. 2 brothers purchased them. One has property on Guaymas, and so he wanted the sculpture to face Hawaii, where the other brother's sculpture will be installed, and the one in Hawaii faces Guaymas. And I just think it's such a touching story. But it's quite tall, stands proud in the landscape. It's a nice piece. So my relationship with the Bronze Foundry is really been positive and a great experience, and I love seeing my work in bronze. And bronze is also a legacy material. It doesn't corrode, it doesn't, we have many beautiful bronze pieces from antiquity in perfect condition. So I now sometimes give my clients an option that I can see this in bronze, or I can see it in stone. And this particular project, I did a Poseidon in bronze. So you're seeing the process. This is in my studio in Seattle. He's an unusual Poseidon. I originally had him on a pedestal, but now I decided he needed a pond, and he needed to be pouring water into this pond because we live in the Northwest, but many of these properties are so deep that the architecture is remote from the sea. And so we need a way to bring that sea up to the residence, right? And so that was the idea here. He's pouring water into this pond that I made. And here is the bronze. Now, in my idea, you can't deal with a modern Poseidon without dealing with the damage we've done to the sea. So my Poseidon, a modern Poseidon, is assembled out of sea trash. So you see bits of cooler, bits of foam, bits of styrofoam, and then he's tangled in wire, which looks like fishing line, perhaps. And you see the application of the patina and the finish work. So one more sculpture to show you, and then take any questions you might have. This is a really important sculpture near and dear to my heart, because not just because I spent 8 years trying to figure out how to make carpet. It's one of the most ambitious sculptures I've done. There are 26 pieces that create what looks like an arch, except there's a missing piece. And that missing piece sits underneath as a bench. And one of the experiences we have when we approach work that's real art, right? Like, what is real art? I don't know. But when I'm moved by art, there's a kind of an electric feeling that happens where, and it's similar to danger, like the piece can be kind of buzzing from me, and it feels a little bit dangerous. Well, this piece has that experience partly because it survives, it's resolute, even though there's this piece missing, and it should fail. So that was the idea. To work it out, it's very, very technical, and I won't go into the details, but this again is in my studio in China. I built a half-scale prototype to see if it would work. And here's the victory moment. I pulled the form and it stood with the gap, and we're all sort of, pretty excited about it. I sold that mock-up and installed it in Santa Fe to a collector there. This is early in the process when it was finished, but now they've landscaped it and made it look quite different. But you see how it stands, and in this picture, you can't really get the scale of it, but this is half the scale of the one that I intended to build, which is on the civic scale, 27 feet long, 20 feet tall, right? So here's the big one. And this is in front of my studio in China, putting it together. That's me up on the right side, on the form, on the centering, and beginning to take the centering down with the crane, and you can see it still standing. That orange frame is an exhibition frame, so that would be buried. You wouldn't see that in the final thing. And that piece that sits underneath would be resting on the ground, not on the frame. So you see it kind of finished. This guy is my head guy at the studio for 20 years, Billy, and kind of a nice moment with Billy. So I presented this idea to Burning Man, to the organization, and they got very excited and gave me their top, I forget what they call it. It's like their award to support bringing it to Burning Man, which is very, very difficult. This is a 25-ton sculpture, hand-carved, 26 pieces. It takes a crew of 45. You have to build a camp to support your crew to then build the sculpture. It's a lot. We did. And it looked magnificent, I have to say. Unfortunately, about halfway, right towards the end, we discovered we had a technical problem. And so we decided to stop at this point and not extend the last final pieces. And we used those pieces underneath to keep people from driving through it, because Burning Man is a no rules, anything goes kind of place. And I really didn't want somebody to drive through it, miss, and hit the sculpture. So we made it kind of a little bit of an obstacle. But unfortunately, we don't see it at exhibition with that very dramatic tension between those 2 points, which is part of the intense vitality of the piece. But there it is. You see people enjoying it. So I was very excited because at the end of this, it looked like lots of people were interested in it. Google contacted me and wanted to consider it for their new campus down in Mountain View. And they wanted an even bigger one. So I did this almost double-sized version, which I thought, should work, sort of. In the end, they went for something flashier with more lights and things. And, oh well, but it's nice to be asked. It also looked like it was going to go to Venice, to the Biennale, and I was very excited. I did a number of fundraisers for it. And in the end, taking a 25-ton sculpture into a city that's sinking is very, very expensive. And so I was forced to return all the money that I had raised and tell people that I had backed out of it because I didn't think there was actually enough money in the world to do this. And I was worried that I would get caught short. So it's been in storage since then, and I'm kind of upset about it because it's one of my best pieces. I will say that one really good thing that could come out of it is that the Obamas are looking at it for the Presidential Library in Chicago. And you may remember that Obama revived a quote from Martin Luther King, which is that the moral arc of history bends towards justice. And so the idea is that this could be in front of the library and have Martin Luther King's quote in bronze below and Obama's cite Obama's speech, and it would be a magnificent symbol for the unfinished work left to do in our country. So a group of Democrats, actually Northwest Democrats, wrote the Obamas and optioned the sculpture and are willing to donate it to the Obama Library. But it's a long process, and meanwhile, it sits in storage. So the romantic life of an artist, right?
Things happen.
Anyway, if you have questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Thank you for your attention. Yeah.
I don't expect the magician to give away all the secrets, but that piece of the arch,
Yeah.
is it mechanically connected with stone, or do you have steel in there also? You got steel in your bond beam.
Yeah.
There's a bond beam, right?
Right.
In that Burning Man, it was steel, I beam.
Yeah. So that's a steel I-beam,
So then,
and then there's a thing over it. But
is there cable in there, or is there steel in there? Or is
you heard about Gorilla Tape? No, actually, I believe I'm one of the first artists to leverage this. It's a NASA grade material. We jokingly call it unobtainium. But it's basically there's a metal rod, a series of metal rods inside that under intense pressure elongate rather than they fight. This metal fights something called hydrogen embrittlement, which is when things get hard, they get brittle and break. And this actually, when it's under extreme stress, it stretches just a little bit, just enough to resist hydrogen embrittlement. So that's technically how it's done. I believe I'm the first artist to use this material. It is tricky, and we had issues, and that's part of why it didn't complete at Burning Man. We got it to a certain point, and we felt like, not 100%. So I've worked out those issues, and I'm ready to put it up somewhere, and it will work. But
Is the
yeah,
stone
tricky stuff.
compression then?
It's a giant cantilever, and there's actually 250,000 pounds of pressure out on the tip, and those forces go back on the arch and then in that long beam that's effectively buried, would be buried.
So the stone is just spacers.
Stone is in compression.
Yeah.
So granite in particular, is enormously strong in compression, and stone is brittle in shear. So we use stone, you always try to use it for what it does best, not for what it does worse. So it's all in compression.
I got one more compression question.
Yeah.
Way back at the beginning in Cusco, what is the foundation under that massive wall? What's the foundation?
There is it would be rock.
Bedrock.
It would ideally be bedrock. I'm not sure it is, and I don't know the answer. I know the guy that would know the answer, and he's probably watching on Zoom. Vince Lee would know the answer. So if you give me your email, I'll get in touch with Vince, and we'll ask him what he thinks is the foundation. But typically, it would be living rock underneath, something that's substantial.
We have a few questions here. First, Jens Cruz, an author on the island, former professor at Wellesley, German literature. He wrote a recent book and wrote a book recently and spoke here. He loved your Poseidon sculpture, and you might like Kafka's story called Poseidon.
Thank you for the tip. Yes, I will look it up. I love Kafka.
And Stephen Boyle said, great lecture, Richard. Some spectacular projects. Love the bankers in your first studio. And then Mary Johansson says, what a fabulous presentation. Thank you so much. And let me ask Mike Rhodes.
Mike Rhodes.
Yes.
Hey, bro.
You spoke about using the large saw when necessary to cut the great granite slabs, but otherwise you use hand tools. Besides the fact that this is how you are trained, can you discuss why this method appeals to you, ancient technique versus modern efficiency?
That's a great question, Mike. And I think, there are things that you can do with modern technology, but a lot of that is faster because you don't have to know anything. If you have the knowledge, and I'll give you an example. I can drill, a few holes, and I've done this in a 12-foot block, a few holes like every 7 or 9 inches across the block, and I can split that block in an hour. because I know I can read the grain of the stone. I know, I know how to do it. And I can split it in a straight line. It would take 4 or 5 days to do that same cut. So yeah, if you don't know how to do it, that saw will allow you to cut any direction, because the saw is just, kind of dumb mechanics in a certain way. It can go in any direction. Now, the beauty of that is that I can only split the block along the grain, where the saw would allow me to go in any direction. It's a tricky trade-off. But the ancient knowledge, look what civilizations built before they had any tools. I look at the Egyptian work and I'm completely humbled, because they achieved levels of accuracy and levels of craftsmanship that we can't do with our computer design. We just can't do it. So I'm not sure that technology is the answer. I think that many times it has much more to do with that ancient and sacred knowledge, and that kind of working with the material and really working to be in the material, in the consciousness of the material, if that's not too abstract a term, so that you're carving through the material. And that's not a perfect answer to your question, but I know where you live. We'll follow up.
As a librarian, I'm really curious how you number all those pieces.
Yeah,
Is it a secret?
it's not a secret. It's so basic, in that, you want to keep it really simple, because very quickly you end up with a Tetris problem, and I'm not that clever, right? So it has to do with the cardinal direction, and then you have basic conventions. Do you go left to right or right to left? It doesn't matter, as long as you always go the same direction, right? So you're consistent, and then you might have types, like all the corners are elevation X, corners Z, so it's essentially an address. I've always had this fantasy that there would be little RFI chips, like you would put in your pet, and I could stand there with a scanner. But I can barely get my iPhone to work. The odds of me getting a scanner to tell me where my stone is just, I don't trust it. So I've always done it the old-fashioned way, old school. I also I brought some party favors for those of you in the room, and anybody who's not in the room who needs a party favor. If you send me an email, I will put one in the old-fashioned post. But I brought these postcards, which have my TED Talk on the back. QR code. If you scan that, you go to my TED Talk. It's also you can just search for it under Richard Rhodes, Hammer, Chisel, Stone. Simple Tools for Hard Moments, it's called. This is my main sculpture brochure. You're welcome to take these, and you're welcome to take a couple extra if you feel like there's somebody who should have it, because that's the way sculpture works. People don't commission beautiful things for the landscape by going into a gallery. They do it because somebody they trust and respect put something in their hands and said, you should pay attention to this guy, and you should know about it. Maybe you have some work. That's how work comes. So take as many as you can use. I trust you to deploy them to all the right places. And then this is just a little catalog brochure of a recent exhibition of stone tables. Stone tables are like the haiku poetry of stone. Very difficult, because you have a stop and a start and a cantilever, and it can't fall over and kill people, and yet it all has to work. And it's a very, very difficult thing to solve. So this is a collection of tables, and they're on exhibition currently in Santa Fe, if you're down there. And I have a couple in Seattle. So anyway, thank you very much for attending.
Yeah, and any other questions?
What's your
Yeah.
favorite stone to carve in?
Well, so I'm a granite carver, which is, you know, which most people think is masochism, and it is. But it also has, in terms of the enduring quality, it's the stone that goes the farthest, right? It's the hardest stone, and therefore, you know, what you make will last the longest. It's not for a person who wants to make a lot of stuff. I'm not in that camp. I want to make a few things perfectly and be known for those things. And I don't care whether that number is 10 or whether it's 50, but it's not going to be 1,000. I'm not cranking stuff out. It's not the way my brain works, and it's not the way. So in a way, granite is the right amount of resistance, and it requires the right amount of planning and preparation for the way I work. Is that right? Yeah.
You mentioned it took 45 people to assemble your arch.
Yeah.
How many people did it take to carve it?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So, you know, let me back up. The 45 is a little bit of exaggeration. There were 6 of us on the close team, and then a lot of people in support positions around those 6, right? So I could have done it with 6 people and a massive catering budget and a massive, you know what I mean? But so the group is 45. I had 18 carvers working for 8 months to carve it. It's a lot of carving, all carved by hand. Remember, it's tapering and curving, and there's a lot of stuff happening inside that you can't see. And it all, you know, comes out of the ground in a square block-ish, you know. So, and it has to be mated perfectly because it's all in this very intense compression using these unobtainium rods to create the illusion. Yeah.
And with your 250,000 pounds, I think you said,
Yeah.
Was that a calculated number, or did you have a?
That's a calculated number, and that includes the hurricane. You know, you have to calculate everything, right? So you have, you know, the wind load, and you know, what are we engineering for? So we're engineering for 250,000 pounds of force, which is a big number in anybody's world, you know. And that took a lot of it took a, you know, we broke, I mean, the reason I'm so proud of that sculpture is it broke new ground in a bunch of ways, right? Not just for me and my career, but it broke technical ground, and it achieved something in a number of ways that you know, hadn't been done before. Yeah.
The engineer, did you consult with an engineer and insurance and all? How did that fit into your breaking new ground? Because it was risky, right?
Yeah.
According to, you scared people.
Yeah. Well, there's a great story there. So I went to turns out the biggest badass engineering firm in the entire world is in Seattle. They designed the Twin Towers and the replacement for the Twin Towers. And I went to them and said, I figured out something in stone that no one's ever done before, and you guys should engineer it, obviously, because you're the best, but you should do it pro bono because I'm an artist. And they were like, well, that's bold. And I said, yeah. And they said, well, show us the thing. And I showed them, and they're like, we'd be honored to do that pro bono. And they did it pro bono. And they put their smartest guy on it for a long time. And they modeled it, and they, you know, and, I mean, computer models, and like, it was wild, the stuff that they were doing. And I solved it with them, you know. That's a good story, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Sometimes it's better to just be lucky.
I got another one.
Yeah.
You said you feel like your feeling is that technology, you're not sure if technology is the answer to solve certain problems.
Yeah.
Do you employ CNC?
Yeah, so I don't do any CNC. I don't
So-
scan my sculptures with scanners. I don't do any 3D modeling. I mean, this is somatic knowledge effectively. In the school that I'm trained in, right? Like I'm feeling my way through the material. And I think for me, that's the way that we energize the material and make it vital. Otherwise it's a dead shape. So there's something that technology can't do. I think you'd enjoy my TED Talk because I address technology specifically in that talk. And essentially I'm saying, hand tools, right? This is about immediacy. It's about the visceral connection to the material and how we call that out of the material. I mean, it's hard. These are hard concepts, in this rationalist culture that we're in. We've lost a lot of the vocabulary for what I'm trying to say, but there's something there. And I may have said it better in the TED Talk. Yeah.
Have you ever seen or visited the Cyclopean ruins in Signy, Italy? Signy, Italy? That sounds
So yeah, I do. I know what you're talking about. So Cyclopean is a term that we apply to walls that are so big where the scale of the massing of the wall is so big that we think only that locals thought only the god Cyclops could have assembled them. So Cyclopean walls is a term that you'll hear applied, but there are some magnificent Cyclopean walls outside Rome, about an hour and 15 minutes. And those were some of the best Cyclopean work in all of Italy. And I'm pretty sure that that's the place you're speaking of.
big limestone.
Yeah, big limestone, white bleached limestone pieces. Yeah, and one of the first earliest carved voussoir arches is also there. And I'm forgetting the name at the moment, but I have pictures of it in my book. Yeah.
Well, Richard, thank you.
Yes, sir, welcome.
Let you go for evening. Thank you to everyone who's on Zoom. I don't have any more questions here. So with that, bye everybody in Zoom land. Thanks for coming. Thank you very much. Bravo, thank you, says Holly. Thank you, Richard, for a very informative talk, said Helen Johnson.
Oh, that's nice.
Yes.